Good morning, everyone. My name is George Tufik. I'm at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, where I'm an associate professor. I'm also the director of quality assurance at Rutgers, the director of the anesthesia simulation program. I'm on the ASA Monitor editorial board, and I'm an associate editor for CME for anesthesiology. And this morning, I'm going to be talking to you about an important issue, contracts and compensation. We're going to go over some essential considerations for residents and junior attendings. So before we get started, I have no disclosures. And so our learning objectives today, the things that we're going to be going over, we're going to review different types of anesthesia groups. We're going to discuss different types of jobs. We're going to go over some contract essentials. We'll review hours and calls and why they're important in your contracts. We're going to go over restrictive covenants, also called non-compete clauses. We're going to discuss briefly termination clauses. Clinical responsibilities, we'll touch upon benefits, mandatory arbitration, and then just some of my recommendations from being out in the workforce and from interacting with residents and dealing with a lot of these issues myself as well. So before we get started, so receiving a contract, signing a contract really is a huge milestone for a resident, a fellow, or a junior attending. And if you step back, it's something that can ultimately impact your future livelihood. It'll impact where you live, your geographic location. It might also end up impacting your future job prospects, where you go afterwards, whether or not you're marketable. And then ultimately your career satisfaction as well will be significantly impacted by the type of contract that you sign and where you end up. The thing is that a lot of residencies and fellowships don't include training on contract essentials, negotiations, or group structures. So my goal today is to arm you with information and essential points to consider before you begin your search. So first, let's talk about different types of anesthesia groups. So a lot of different models exist for group structures. It's really important to be familiar with them, especially as you're going through the contracting process. Group structure itself should be a critical consideration as you go out on the interview trail and consider a group to join ultimately after your training or after your current job. So this is just a very general overview of the types of groups. This is not all encompassing, but generally speaking, it ranges anywhere from a solo practice, which is an anesthesiologist who practices on their own and bills the patient directly. So what's different about this model is the physician pays for their own malpractice and billing, but it could be done in a variety of different types of settings. So you could have a solo practice within a hospital where there is still a clinical chairman doing assignments and sending people out to different cases on their own. Or it could be a solo practice where it's just a one-room outpatient center and you're the person who's covering that center and all those cases on their own. So that's a solo practice. This is generally pretty rare these days to find this, but it still does exist in some places where you do the case, you do the billing, everything is on your own, malpractice, etc. So group practices are much more common. So this is a group of providers who work in concert to share the clinical workload at a location, such as a hospital, an ambulatory surgery center, or a combination of both. So it could be private practice owned by the physicians or an academic practice, or we'll talk a little bit about corporate types of practices very, very shortly. The thing about these types of group practices is that they tend to have the contract to cover anesthesia either solely or in concert with another group at a facility. So it could be that they're the sole provider of anesthesia at a hospital or a hospital system or at a surgery center where they might share a contract, etc. So this is a group practice. There's also employed physician practices. You might be familiar with some of these names. So this is run by a management corporation such as Envision, NAPA, which is North American Partners in Anesthesia, USAP, which is United States Anesthesia Partners. And there's also hospital employment-based models as well. So it's not that it's a sole proprietor like a solo anesthesiologist, and it's not necessarily a group where the people within the group own the practice. This is... I didn't do anything, I swear. I don't know what that was, sorry. So again, in terms of different types of practices, there's also hybrid models. There are academic practices that may or may not have a billing component to them. And then there's national corporations such as USAP, which have a partial private equity partnership. So it's a management corporation, but it's not wholly owned by another financial entity. And the physicians within that group still do own some equity within those practices. Ultimately, there's pluses and minuses to all different types of practices that you join. And these are just some potential ones. I'm not saying that these are universal or particularly applicable to you. Just generally speaking, these are some of the potential pluses and minuses. So if you do a solo practice, you potentially could have higher income. There's no one else to pay for HR or for a back office setting. You do the case, you collect the money. If it's a good payer population, you could potentially make a lot more money. And you can control your own schedule. So you don't want to work next week to go down to the beach, you can do that. You want to take the month of August off, you can do that as well. The negative potential is that it's an unpredictable schedule. Next week, I really want to work, I have nothing to do, but I might not be able to find a shift. There might not be any income without work. So generally speaking, you have to figure out billing and insurance on your own. And generally you don't have any individual benefits. You'll have to go out on the marketplace and buy them. So in terms of group practice, some of the general overall potential pluses include stability. So a lot of groups have had a contract at a hospital for 20 years, 30 years. That's relatively stable. Or the group has the contract for an entire health system. That's relatively stable. There's a shared clinical workload. You're having a really difficult case that ran over here and you're due over in the GI lab. Someone else from your group can go over there and cover that. If you're in a solo practice, that might not be the case. Distributed call burden as well, so you're not the one taking all of the calls. And then benefits are generally cheaper in a larger practice as well. When you've got 100 people trying to buy insurance, that's generally cheaper than one person. Now, the potential negatives is that there's potentially lower income. With a bigger group, you've got a bigger office staff. There's more money that's coming in as revenue that's got to go to pay administrative fees and things like that. You're potentially working for someone else. Hey, I just want to do GI at this little center, but they're sending me to, interventional radiology. You might not have a choice as to where you're being assigned. You're generally subject to the group's caseload and clinical sites. So your group is now taking over an eye center where it's cataracts all day and you hate cataracts. They're going to send you to do cataracts maybe. So you're not generally in charge of where you're going to go, but a lot of times they'll work with you and things like that if there are special considerations. Again, these are large scale generalities. With an employed practice, like one of these large management groups, there's generally also stability. And then you get into economies of scale. Now you're not talking about a group of 50, 60, 70 anesthesiologists. You're talking about potential thousands of clinicians across the country, and they're negotiating benefits. So there's potentially even more lucrative in health insurance, dental insurance, retirement benefits, et cetera. But then again, you're potentially also subject to outside management. And the issue with these employed practice is potentially, again, is that you might be answering to someone who's not down the hall anymore in the chair's office, but a regional medical director or a state medical director, et cetera. Again, large generalities, but generally speaking, these are the kinds of pluses and minuses you can experience with these different types of groups. So what are the different job types? So there's a salaried employee position. So salary is generally associated with a set call schedule and a call burden and a set daily schedule. Your salary is X amount of dollars for 45 hours a week and 4 overnight calls a month. That is potentially a situation that you could have. Generally, rates for extra calls or after hours coverage may be stipulated in a contract like this. We'll talk about why it's so important in a little bit. So some contracts can offer a portion that's productivity based. So for example, a flat salary is offered for a defined number of RVUs, which in our case as anesthesiologists are ASA units. And if the anesthesiologist exceeds those units, a bonus may be given. That's just an example of a potential productivity-based bonus. But productivity metrics can be tied to any number of potential factors based on the practice's considerations. It could be tied to quality metrics. It could be tied to patient feedback surveys, et cetera. So what's a partnership track position? You may have heard of this term as well. So a partnership track position promises an ownership share or a stake in a privately owned group, often after a set period such as 2 to 4 years. I've heard of some areas in the country that do it even faster, within like 12 months. That's mostly like on the West Coast of what I've heard as well. But it's generally after a set defined period of time, you're going to be offered shares within that corporation. So it's important to note that these jobs may pay lower than market rates to use the difference in money as a buy-in for the practice. They may. There's almost always no explicit guarantee of ownership following the time designated in a partnership track contract, only the potential of an offer of ownership. So it's really important to know that. So at the end of your 4 years, you might not necessarily be made a partner. And I know numerous people from personal experience who have gone through partnership tracks and not been made partner at the end of that partnership track time period. As I know a numerous number of people who have completed it and gotten partnership. But just know that it's generally speaking at the end of that partnership track time, it says you will be given an option to become a partner within that group. Some jobs may offer what are called junior partnerships on day one, with diluted billing provided as compensation, with subsequent increases based upon experience. So, for example, if a full partner in a group gets 100% of the revenue that they generate after paying the administrative expenses, the malpractice, etc., a junior partnership might be 50% for year one. So you get 50% of what a partner would get as their share of the revenue. And then maybe on year two, it would be 75%. And then year three, you're a full partner like everyone else. That's just one example of how it could be structured. So it also should be considered that some partnership groups have tiered partnerships, in which certain partners have added benefits not available to junior partners. For example, at my first group, in my first job out of residency, there were at least 3 different partnership tiers after being made partners. So there were the junior partners, there were the senior partners who were in a special call pool, there were the super senior partners who just went to a select group of ambulatory surgery centers. And then there was even one layer on top of that who were part of the billing company. So I'm not saying, again, that every group is structured like this, but just saying partner, non-partner, just know that in some groups, partners might not all be equal as well. So there's a lot of important facts to consider. First, and I really cannot emphasize this enough, it's really important to consult with an employment or labor attorney before signing a contract to ensure that your interests are fully protected. I appreciate you coming today, but I am not a replacement for a lawyer by any means. This is not meant to be legal advice. So before you do sign a contract, it really is important to consult with an attorney. And if you're a resident, some places might have special resources available for residents. For example, at our institution, our residents are unionized, and through the union, they do have free labor attorneys who do review the contracts for them. It's really important that compensation should be in writing. You'd be surprised, I've seen contracts that residents show me that do not have the compensation explicitly in the writing. Salaries need to be outlined with potential future raises as well, built in. And there's also sometimes they put in potential contingencies such as board certification. So for example, where I'm employed, we have a board certification provision that if you're not board certified within 2 years after being hired, they let you go. And it's not uncommon to see that kind of stuff for board eligible contracts coming out. They understand you're not board certified on day one after your residency, but they give you a grace period usually of a couple of years. Again, not in every contract, but it might be in yours. So productivity bonuses and the metrics upon which they're calculated really should be included in the contract. And the reason that's important is that if you look on GasWorks, for example, a lot of times you'll see something that'll say a really great number, 550, 600, 650, all inclusive. And a lot of times what that'll actually mean is that it includes a productivity-based bonus at the end of the year that they're counting towards your compensation. Now, if that's $2,000 or $3,000, it might not make a huge amount of difference for your compensation at the end of the year. But if they're taking a huge chunk, 15, 20, 25% of your compensation and tying it to that productivity, you want to know on day one, what is that productivity-based metric that they're going to base such a big chunk of my compensation on? It's really important to have a detailed description of partnership opportunities. If you're signing a partnership track contract, what does that mean at the end? Are they decreasing my salary for a set period of time and using that as my buy-in? Or will I owe them a big check at the end as my purchase of the shares? They might say at the end of your 3 years, 4 years, you will be given the option to purchase a share for $40,000, $50,000, for example, potentially. Professional development expenses such as licensure and ASA membership may be covered in a contract as well. And this is important due to the heavy cost often associated with these fees, depending on the state. So once you add it all up, the ASA is a phenomenal organization. We're all members of it. But as attendings after residency, it can be pricey. And then when you add that in with your MOCA certification to maintain your certification in anesthesiology and purchasing CME credits and your ACLS and, PEARLS and everything else, this money starts to add up. So professional development expenses, including potentially money to come to educational conferences, should be outlined if they're telling you that it's part of your contract. So hours and calls are a really important component of the contract, and it's one you'd be surprised on how many people sleep on this part of the contract. It really is to your benefit as the anesthesiologist for your contract to be as specific as possible with daily and weekly hours, as well as call requirements and specifications of call hours. Why is that specificity important? For example, some groups require you to be on home beeper call on a post-call day. If that's not written in your contract that that's compensated, you might just be expected to go home, hold on to that beeper, be ready at a moment's notice, and not be getting paid for that time. During that time, you might not be able to schedule your dentist appointment and might have to figure out childcare because you're holding that beeper and might have to drop things at a moment's notice to go to the hospital. But that is something that should be compensated, especially if it's something that's really going to be happening on a frequent basis. Is there a difference in pay between home and in-house call? Oh, don't worry about it. Our calls are great. Everyone takes call from home. Well, are you getting paid the same for an at-home call as you are if you spend the night, down the hall from L&D? If you're required to take 5 overnight calls a month, how is call number 6 compensated? Some places just say 45 hours a week, 5 calls a month, and they don't have a stipulation for what call number 6 is paid at. It's to your benefit to have it be as specific as possible as to what that extra call compensation structure is like. And if additional call is mandatory, could it be required due to staffing issues? Let's say you join a group that's 15 people. 15 people, 5 calls a month, that's great. All of a sudden, one person retires and one person gets diagnosed with a tragic illness. 15 becomes 13. That does not necessarily sound like a huge thing, but every week you've got 2 or 3 people in the group who are on vacation, and now your call pool keeps shrinking. So instead of 5 calls a month, they might need everyone to take 7 calls a month, but you made plans already. Can they force you to take calls 6 and 7? That should be in the contract. Or do they have liberal language in there that says at the discretion of the chairman, which sometimes I've seen in contracts as well. So again, specificity in terms of call hours, really important. A restrictive covenant. You may have heard this term. It's also known colloquially as a non-compete clause. A restrictive covenant is a clause in a contract that prevents an employee from working at institutions or within a specified geographic radius following termination of employment from a particular group. It's really important to know that it's triggered regardless of whether the employer or employee initiated the termination. If they let you go for some reason, it's still generally in place, if you quit, same kind of thing. Restrictive covenant is generally not limited to who makes the decision to leave the group and to sever that relationship. So a restrictive covenant will specify the time of the restriction. Usually it's between 1 and 3 years, the facilities included, and potential radius around those facilities. Usually, it's hard to negotiate out of a contract completely, but sometimes you can decrease the radius or the length of time. It's an important consideration for an attending due to their ties to a particular geographic location and what facilities would potentially be restricted for future employment. If you really cannot leave the geographic area that you're about to sign a contract, but they give you a 30-mile non-compete clause for any healthcare facility in that area, that might be a huge determination when you go to sign a contract because you cannot move. If, on the contrary, you have no geographic ties, you're just here because they gave you a great offer and you could drop at the moment of notice and move somewhere else across the country and it's no big deal, you could sign a 100-mile restrictive covenant and it wouldn't bother you. Again, a lot of these things come down to individual preference and the geographic location and its importance to you. These have made a lot of news recently. I'm not going to go through these all in detail, but there's a lot of states that are limiting non-compete specifically for healthcare, such as Arkansas and Colorado. So they're making little carve-outs for physicians. There are full bans in some states, and there are also income thresholds and carve-out models, again, for physicians or for special providers. And generally speaking, there's more scrutiny over non-solicitation or confidentiality clauses, which are part of the non-compete clauses as well. So, for example, even where non-competes remain permissible, courts and regulators are paying more attention to whether non-solicitation, non-disclosure, or training repayment provisions are being used in a manner that effectively acts as a de facto non-compete. But the FTC's proposed ban, which you may have heard about, which happened a couple years ago and has gone kind of back and forth, does not cover legitimate confidentiality in non-disclosure agreements, but warns that overly broad language to restrict mobility may be scrutinized as well. So this is basically a long-winded way of saying that it's still kind of up in flux. So what are some potential recommendations that you could do to mitigate its impact on you? You could negotiate carve-outs for patient care. So try to include language that permits continued treatment of existing patients or phase transitions of care, which can reduce risk of invalidation. This might be more of a consideration if you're a pain physician or if you're someone who works in critical care. It's important to try to get them to favor non-solicitation, confidentiality, and training repayments over non-competes. They may be more acceptable and more defensible so long as they're narrowly written and not used as disguised non-competes. What are they really looking for? You might say to yourself, this is all so silly. Why would an anesthesiologist even have a non-compete? Well, I'll tell you the scenario that they're really looking for. So in my first job, I was at primarily a hospital, but I was sent out to 10 to 12 surgery centers in the area. The group that I was with did a lot of work to solicit those contracts, to build relationships with those surgeons, and to get the anesthesia contracts for them. A couple of the centers really liked me. If they wanted to, they could have potentially said, hey, forget these guys that are at your hospital. Why don't you just do the anesthesia for us full time? We know you, we like you, we work with you. We'll give you our anesthesia. It would work out great for me because I'd make more money and then cut them out. That's the situation. I didn't do that. But that's the scenario that they're kind of trying to play out. And I know from personal experience, I know that there are places where this kind of stuff has happened. And from what I've seen, these are the kinds of things that really do go to court and end up being like multi-million-dollar lawsuits. Because again, that group went in and facilitated a relationship with those surgeons, with that surgery center, with whoever owns that surgery center to get that contract. Really, that's the main scenario that they're really trying to protect against. If you go to the hospital across the street that has a contract, I'm not saying that they won't sue you, but they're not worried about you taking their business because they didn't have that business. It's important to monitor changing laws and litigation outcomes. So with active legislation and court challenges, a non-compete that's enforceable today may become void tomorrow. There might be more FTC rule changes. We're really not sure. If the FTC's non-compete rule ultimately becomes binding, it could override many state-level covenants. As you saw from the last slide, a lot of this stuff has come down to state law, really. So practices that use the non-competes really should watch that litigation closely. And then document legitimate business interest. An employer should clearly document why a restrictive covenant is necessary, investments in recruitment, training, protection of patient relationships, trade secrets to increase their chance of enforceability. So, termination clause. Really, don't forget about this. Even if you think you'll never leave the job, I found the place, I found the greatest, group. I fell in love with the surgeons and the hospital and the weather and everything's great. I'm never leaving this job. I'm going to spend my entire career here. Still, please focus on the termination clause. It might not seem like it's important, but I'll tell you why it is. What is a termination clause? It's the length of notice required for an employee to terminate their contract, and it really should be written explicitly in the contract. Generally speaking, the shorter the notification period, often the better for the employee. Remember that a prospective employer is often trying to fill a gap in coverage and can't wait on a prospect for a long time. So generally, they need someone now, they want you as soon as possible. The exception to this, generally for prospective employers, is your first job out of residency. They know that you physically cannot be there and join that group until July or August after you graduate residency. That's a different story. But otherwise, they're generally trying to fill a gap in coverage and they want you as soon as possible. The problem with that is that too short a period might be detrimental. Obtaining privileges at a new facility takes time as well. For those who have not had the privilege of going through credentialing process yet, at a new facility, you generally get a stack of papers this big, and they want to know everywhere you've ever practiced. They want to know from every malpractice carrier that you've ever had, if you've ever had a claim against you on every single job. So the more places you work, the longer this whole process ends up taking. So just because the prospective employer wants you to start next week because they had some kind of emergency, still does not mean that they will necessarily be able to get you in next week. Credentialing generally takes some time. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there are sometimes additional caveats in a termination clause, such as a potential termination for failure to obtain board certification. And sometimes this is something else to watch. Sometimes they have termination clauses due to loss of a contract to provide anesthesia services at a clinical location. So if they're hiring you because they project that in 3 months they're going to be taking over this new facility, what is going to happen if for some reason, and this stuff happens all the time, that facility changes their mind and they're keeping their old anesthesia group, or they got outbid by someone else? Do you still have a job? Because now your family just moved 3,000 miles across the country for that job. That's the kind of thing you want to know, especially if you're joining specifically to fill that kind of position. We're expanding into a new area. Well, you didn't take it yet. What happens if you don't? Clinical responsibilities are really important as well. So responsibilities of an anesthesiologist in the clinical setting should be clearly outlined in an employment contract. There's a lot of different models of coverage in both in and outpatient clinical settings. So an anesthesiologist might be working on their own, always performing anesthesia on their own cases. That's an MD-only type of practice. But it could also be a clinical supervision model employed by a group comprised of CRNAs, resident trainees, CAAs, or other mid-level providers such as physician assistants or nurse practitioners. Specific billing or regulatory requirements may dictate how a group ends up operating. So generally speaking, this is how things work. MD direction is used for supervision of 4 or fewer residents and or CRNAs and allows the anesthesiologist and group to bill at a higher level. So the requirements of MD direction include the performance of a pre-op exam in which the anesthesiologist assesses the ASA level, the patient's airway, and prescribes the anesthetic plan. The anesthesiologist must also be present for induction, emergence, and all critical portions of the anesthetic and be immediately available at all times. That's very different from another model, which is called MD supervision, in which a qualified non-physician anesthetist, such as a CRNA, performs most of the significant portions of the anesthetic alone. The physician anesthesiologist is supervising more than 4 cases concurrently. So it's not uncommon for an anesthesiologist to be MD supervision over 8 people, 10 people, etc. It's important for the candidate to consider what type of practice they'd be comfortable joining. Some practices may also employ a combination of different types of clinical models. There might be MD only with a small group of residents, and you might just work with them on OB or when you're on call. There might be an MD only model where they've got CRNAs that help out with breaks, or they were hired because the place is a really, busy GI practice and the CRNAs do breaks in GI, for example. Benefits are really important, and they could be a critical component of a physician anesthesiologist's compensation package. It could have a significant influence on the choice of whether or not to take a certain position. Benefits often include such things as health insurance, dental insurance, vision, disability, and retirement accounts. Very, very generally, health insurance ranges from low premium, high deductible plans to high premium, low deductible plans. And it really is important on you to consider your own life circumstances and your family's to determine whether a group's offerings fit well with your own personal needs. So just some sample considerations. So if you're a person who's struggling with fertility or your family is struggling with fertility, it might be super important to you that you have an insurance plan that covers IVF because you're thinking maybe in 2 years down the line, you want IVF and you know it's super expensive. If you've got a pre-existing condition or a family with a pre-existing condition that requires specialist visits or a particular medication, does that new plan cover that? If not, it could be thousands of dollars out of pocket, and generally you want to know that. Certain insurance programs may also be limited in geographic coverage or limited to a specific group of providers. Again, if you or someone in your family really needs to see this one expert in CHOP in Philadelphia and you live in Jersey and you're joining a group that only gives you coverage for New Jersey doctors, that might be something that's so important to you that it prevents you from taking a job that you potentially want. Dental, vision, and disability insurance may also be offered. Again, it's really important to consider your own needs and those of your family as to whether or not the presence or absence of any of those makes any difference to you. So retirement benefits. The presence or absence of an employee retirement program should be noted. The group matching, which may or may not be significant, potentially adds a substantial portion towards overall monetary compensation. Again, a lot of times when you look at these jobs, it'll say total package X number of dollars. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll count the matching contributions to a retirement account as part of your overall compensation package. I'm not saying that people are doing it in a duplicitous manner, but it's just that's what's happening out there. They might have this really high number and you're like, whoa, this is amazing. But the actual salary might be lower and they're counting things such as matching funds for a retirement as part of your overall compensation. The vesting period for any employer contribution is potentially an important factor to consider as well. So if you're an anesthesiologist who's not planning on staying at a job for a long period of time, for example, when you have a partner who's going to be in a certain geographic area for fellowship for a year, 2 years, the presence of a prolonged vesting period may prevent you from receiving a significant portion of your compensation before moving to another position. For example, a few years ago, we had a resident that I was counseling who had a 3-year vesting program for retirement, and she had to move with her husband for a 1-year fellowship out west. They didn't have a choice. They were leaving a bunch of money, a not insignificant amount of money on the table, but they knew that ahead of time and they didn't have a choice. They were moving somewhere with not a lot of employment options, but they knew that. They knew they were leaving that money at the table. If you think that you're going to be somewhere for a long period of time, a longer vesting period might not be a big deal for you. Again, the more money that's at stake here, the more important this consideration really should be. Mandatory arbitration is a clause that's permeated through contracts in almost all aspects of life. Even contracts such as those signed for cell phone contracts now contain mandatory arbitration clauses. So what does that mean? So these clauses remove the possibility of utilizing a jury trial to adjudicate disputes between an employee and their employer when placed in an employment contract. They're hard or basically impossible to negotiate out totally of a contract. In addition, it's important to note that some mandatory arbitration clauses include provisions that require the loser of an arbitration to be responsible for the legal fees associated with the action for both sides, further discouraging the potential for legal recourse. Now, why is this important? Let's say, for example, you're working as part of a group and you're a non-partnership track person and you are working extra call hours. And they're not paying for you for those extra calls. So now you want to sue for those extra call hours. If you find out that everyone else in your group, then there's 10, 15 of you who are non-partners, are also not getting paid for your extra call hours, you guys could team up. You could hire one attorney and then sue collectively. With a mandatory arbitration clause, that's out of the picture. You can't do that. And a lot of times you can't even know that someone else is doing a mandatory arbitration as well. So there are all these little legal loopholes and stuff that are in there, which is again why I say consult with a lawyer before you sign one of these contracts. Intellectual property. If you're an inventor or have an entrepreneurial spirit, it's really important to pay attention to the intellectual property clause. So an employer may own anything you develop during the time of employment, even if you do all the work on your own time, depending on how the intellectual property clause is written. Alternate provisions or arrangements may be made, especially when you already have an invention or are working on one. Let's say you've got the next billion-dollar idea sitting in your garage and you're about to start with a new group. I'd put a carve out on there. I would say everything that I'm working on my own free time on device X, which has patent pending B, is mine, and you guys cannot touch it. So malpractice coverage, let's talk about that because that's in employment contracts as well. Generally speaking, there's two types of malpractice coverage. Occurrence-based malpractice coverage provides coverage for the incident during the policy year, regardless of when the claim was filed. And now, depending on the state, it could be 2 years, 3 years down the line that they could sue for. Claims made is provided if the policy is in effect, and then you get coverage if you have coverage when the incident took place and when the claim is filed. So if you are joining a group that has a claims made policy, you want to find out if they'll purchase for you what's called tail insurance, because most of the time you're not going to get sued the day after the incident. In most states, they've got a couple of years in order to be able to sue you. So if you're in a claims made policy, you won't be covered unless you have that active coverage at the time of getting sued, unless you've purchased what's called tail coverage. Generally speaking, tail coverage is between 200 and 250% of the cost of a premium. So most of the time, this is just a range, malpractice insurance for anesthesiologists is somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000. Interestingly, it's at the lowest when you first graduate residency and kind of goes up because you haven't built a repertoire of patients to potentially sue you. But anyway, and then let's say, for example, that it's $10,000. So, and it's 250% potentially of the cost of the premium. So if you're joining a group that has a claims made policy, just know if they're not going to purchase your tail for you, which a lot of the groups do end up doing, it might cost you $25,000 to leave that group to get that malpractice tail coverage. Some places do have what's called prior acts coverage or nose coverage. So if you're joining a new group, leaving a group with claims made policy, you can actually investigate whether or not you could purchase nose coverage, see the opposite of a tail, with the new company to cover you for the stuff that you just had at your claims made policy. But generally, it's easier to purchase a tail. Again, a lot of times it'll say within the employment contract, we're claims made, we do claims made, but if you leave, we purchase your tail for you. And again, this is not an insignificant amount of money. If every time you're thinking about leaving, you have to write a $25,000 check. So $1 million per occurrence, $3 million per annual aggregate is a common arrangement. Some places do 2 and 4. Both types of insurance cover liability, attorney's fees, and monetary damages. Occurrence generally requires no tail and has a fixed cost. Claims made is more affordable initially and then accurately prices premium to risk. So if you were sitting there asking yourself, why would anyone do this tail nonsense? Is generally because if you have lower risk, claims floats to that lower risk and you'll generally pay less than you would on an occurrence-based policy. Signing bonuses can be super attractive. They can be a considerable component of overall compensation, but it's generally tied to meeting milestones, usually a length of period of time. If given up front, there could be a penalty if milestones are not met. One of the most common things that we're seeing with our residents right now is that they're getting SDB, which is a signing date bonus. So they're getting a bunch of money just to sign the contract. Then they get a bunch of money on their first day of employment. Guess what? If you leave before a set period of time, you're giving that money back. You can't just quit and run in 2 weeks, although that would be nice if you could do that. But generally, there will be a significant financial penalty if you leave before a set period of time. And again, this is another one of those areas. I'm not saying that job postings are duplicitous, but sometimes when they say overall compensation, this crazy number, sometimes they include an annualized percentage of the signing date bonus in there as part of that overall compensation. So that number might not actually be the contract moving forward indefinitely. They might be considering that part of your compensation package initially. So what's the difference between a W-2 and 1099? So 1099 is an independent contractor. So taxes, FICA, and Medicare tax are not withheld from the paycheck. You could potentially receive benefits, but you're often responsible for your own insurance and your retirement account. W-2 are employees and are subject to regular tax withholding. Your employer holds those taxes for you and pays them to the federal government on your own. Generally, you receive a benefits package, paid leave, regular income, things like that from a W-2. So why do people do 1099? Because it's generally a higher compensation and you get much more favorable deductions for things that are necessary and ordinary business expenses. If you're driving to a far surgery center, if you use your cell phone for work, you can often deduct those kinds of things. And then 1099 generally goes along with those kinds of jobs that offer you a great deal of flexibility so you work when you want. Now, again, I do have to note, these are big generalities. There are some people who do per diem locums work that get a W-2, and there are some people that I know who are part of a big group that get a 1099. And again, people do these for a variety of different types of financial considerations. Generally, for a 1099, you don't have employee protections. You generally don't receive unemployment benefits or maternity or paternity leave or FMLA. So there's, again, pluses and minuses to this type of work. So some of my crucial recommendations. So seeking employment is very exciting, especially when you consider the on a percentage basis that your salary is about to multiply. And it really is a process that you've got to approach with caution. The most important thing, again, I cannot emphasize it enough, is to have a lawyer review your contract. A properly credentialed labor employment lawyer, that's who you're looking for, a labor employment lawyer, is trained to review contracts for any potential pitfalls or points of future contention. They're going to see the pitfalls. We are all intelligent people, having graduated from medical school or a physician anesthesiologist. This is way outside our wheelhouse. When my first group coming out of residency ended up being acquired by a national corporation, I was handed a 27-page contract. I'd like to think I'm intelligent, but I had no idea what it said. And after like 4 pages, I was like, I can't even read this thing. So I had 2 different lawyers look at it. 27 pages is a lot of legalese and a lot of words that we don't know. I'm not saying all contracts are like that. Most of the ones I've seen for the last few years, there are between 5 and 7 pages, and they're pretty dense. So the lawyers are generally easy to find online or via referral in your social network. Again, for residents, you might have unique considerations through your ACGME office or if you're part of a resident union, et cetera. Generally speaking, I really recommend to our residents, and sometimes I hesitate about putting this out there or not, to start in a hospital setting. Although if you're part of a group in a hospital with outside surgery centers, that's very good as well. A lot of times, the first several years out of residency are when you become comfortable working on your own. That's when you figure out what you like. Up until that time period, you're taping the tube how your attending wants the tube taped. You're choosing how to intubate, how your attending wants you to intubate. You're putting in this kind of needle for your epidural, and you don't really have a choice, and you're dosing your spinal this way. That's going to be the first time where you're the only one. No one else is going to decide. How much medication am I going to put in? What kind of TUI needle do I like? What kind of catheter? Do I like the one that is hard and easier to thread, or the one that's soft but might have less of a potential for wet tap? Those are the kinds of things. And you don't have backup that you've had during your residency. So in today's climate, surgeons are bringing more and more complex cases to ambulatory settings, but a lot of those outpatient settings are specialty specific. So you might be going to a GI only place that's doing unhealthier GIs, but you're still just doing GI. If you want to get a breadth of experience and really figure out what you like, my general recommendation is at least a little bit of your practice should be in a hospital when you're first coming out of residency. And then afterwards, once you've gotten that skill set, you can go to a surgery center. Be mindful of the restrictive covenant. Again, this stuff keeps changing. After the FTC came out and said, we're getting rid of it, then they kind of backtrack and they said, we're not getting rid of it for everybody, just like, Walmart type workers who also had non-compete clauses. And then it changed again. And now every state is passing its own thing, especially if you're changing states, find out what that state's consideration. Again, the importance of this varies for each person. In my situation, I cannot move. My parents live 20 minutes away and my mother-in-law lives 45 minutes away. I think everyone would team up to murder me if I considered leaving my state. I might have a colleague who's in a completely different situation, could pick up and leave and go to Alaska if they wanted to. That person does not care as much about the restrictive covenant. So a lot of times it'll go down to your individual life choices and where you are in your life, how tied you are to that area. And the other thing is that geographic location really does matter as well. So 40 miles in upstate New York is very different than the New York City metro area. If you draw a circle around 40 miles of Manhattan, I don't even have to do the math. I'm sure you can count 1,000 or 2,000 healthcare facilities. Certain areas of upstate New York, if you draw 40 miles around, there literally might be the only healthcare institution in that area. So not all geographic radiuses are the same as well. The other thing that I've seen in contracts with restrictive covenants is sometimes it'll give a geographic radius plus the type of contract that they have. So sometimes I've seen this in the national corporations restrictive covenants that they'll say you cannot work at another facility that has had anesthesia provided by this national corporation within 20 miles around for the next 2 years. Again, if you think about it logically, what are they trying to protect against? They're trying to protect against losing their business. It costs money to take over a center. It costs money to provide coverage for a new place and get billing up and running. So they've sunk cost into a facility and they don't want you swooping in because they like you better to take over their anesthesia contract and take business out of their hands. So that one really does make a lot of sense in a lot of cases. So leaving money on the table for a partnership track position is a really controversial decision. Again, partnership track positions are almost never guaranteed. I know several people off the top of my head who got burned by this, and I'm not saying everyone burns, but like there are certain groups that have a reputation for after the partnership track period not making partners. They look at it kind of like the Harvard rejection rate, I think, something like that. We rejected 98% this year, woohoo. But if you take a significant pay cut for the buy-in period and you're not granted partnership at the end, you might be costing yourself a ton of money. So the consideration really should be the pay differential. Some places are not doing a pay differential at all. Everyone comes in, this is the contract. At the end of 3 or 4 years, you're up for a partnership track. And we might offer you partnership and you'll owe us $5,000 at the end, and that's your share. That sounds great. Some places it's $10,000 lower. Okay, over 3 years, you're giving up $30,000 to potentially make partnership. Not bad. When I came out of residency, the business of anesthesia was hard to get a job, and the partnership track differential was substantial. You were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that people were risking at the time to get a partnership track and potentially not get that at the very end. And they don't give you back pay as if you were a real employee if they don't make you partner at the end. So you kind of want to find out if you're risking potentially not getting a partnership track, how much money you're putting on the table. And if it's significant, it might give you hesitation, especially if it's one of those groups without a great reputation. So you kind of want to know, of the last, 3 groups of people who finished their partnership track, what percentage made partner? Oh, everybody? That's a much more reasonable bet. Oh, only 1 person out of 4 every year? I don't know. Okay, so that kind of stuff you want to be mindful of. Generally, a short partnership track period is always preferable to a long track and likely increases the likelihood of making it to partnership most successfully. 2 years is much easier to navigate without some major catastrophic thing or pissing off the chief of surgery or having a run-in on a bad day with a colleague who's the voting member of the partnership track committee. That's the kind of stuff that I've personally, again, heard derails the partnership track, and that's the stuff that's brought up at the meeting when they vote whether or not to make someone a partner. And if it's 2 years, just statistically, you have a less chance of one of those inciting events preventing you from getting to partner at the very end. Depending on the part of the country in which you're conducting your job search, working for a national management corporation might be the only or a very important option. Generally speaking, groups can vary wildly between practice locations. Oh no, I'm moving to an area that only has X group and I've heard nothing but bad about them. What am I going to do? Well, investigate the local area. A lot of times these places are more hands-off than you think. And a lot of times the culture really is established by the local group of clinicians there. kind of down from the chairman or the medical director of that facility and kind of filters down. So even though you might have a negative perception or your residency director of one of these corporations, don't take that at its face value. Find out, really get on the ground and find out how that group is. But in the contrast, be wary of groups with a bad reputation. If there's a group that's always hiring and now they're throwing crazy signing bonuses out and they have a high churn rate, there's a reason that they can't retain talent. There's a reason that every year they're trying to take all of our residents because no one else wants to work there. But there are some groups you get lucky and they rarely have opportunities. They rarely open up. Oh, we're hiring our first person in 3 years. And, everyone who's with us stays from, the moment they finish their residency until their retirement. That could be a super positive work environment. So you want to find out a little bit more about their reputation. So with that being said, talk to lots of people in the group in which you're considering employment. So you want to get their phone number. When you go to the hospital, they're going to give the most enthusiastic, effusive person to show you around. This is the greatest place ever. But talk to the people who are actually there. Hey, give me the phone number of the last 3 people who the group hired, and so I can speak to them and give them a call. And a lot of times those people will be a lot more honest with you. And the veneer that you got on your recruitment might not be the actual what the people in the trenches are actually saying. For a partnership track position, same thing. Speak to the last several people who made partner. Find out from them, what was it like going through the partnership track? What can they expect? You want to make sure that the work environment matches what you've been promised as well. This is the greatest place ever. You'll be out by 2 every day. People never get called in when they're on call at night. They might say that, but when you talk to someone who's actually in the midst of it, generally they'll be a little more honest with you and they'll say, hey, 2 o'clock is really like 7 every night, or I get called in every time I'm on call. You hear those kinds of things from people who are closer on the ground. And the reason that that's important is that you generally don't want to be in a job for less than 12 to 18 months. It looks bad if you keep jumping jobs. That being said, in today's environment where people are doing locums per diem work, that's a completely different thing. But if you're pursuing a W-2 type contract and you're continuously jumping, someone's going to be like, hey, why is this person not staying here for very long? So those are the kinds of gaps that you're trying to avoid in your resume. And that's all I have for you. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yes, go ahead. Yeah, so same kind of thing with student loan repayment as signing bonuses. Generally, from what I understand of how they're structured, you want to know what the requirements associated with it are. So how long do you have to stay before they do the percentage of the student loan repayment that they're promising you? And potentially, if you leave early, you might have a penalty that negates the student loan repayment. So I would think about it the same way as a signing bonus. Find out what the stipulations with it are, what percentage they're going to pay based on how much time, and if there's a penalty if they don't meet that obligation, or if you don't meet that obligation. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question. Since a lot of people are doing the locum tenens, is there anything in specific you can think of to be wary of with those contracts?
Yeah, so in terms of locums, it's a lot of times super individual as to how it's going to be structured. The anesthesia market is in a place right now where it's so hot that we've never had as many residents coming out who are going straight into locums work as we've ever had. Like really, it was something that when I was coming out as a resident was almost unheard of at the time. But there's so many of these contracts, and a lot of times it's just about the specific provisions of how people are getting paid that they want to look at. I know people personally who have taken locums jobs because they were given a great rate and then they end up getting paid as a W-2 instead of a 1099, and they end up leaving the job because that's the exact opposite of what they want. So with these kinds of situations, especially when you're going to be setting up your own LLC to pay you out, I would also get an accountant who's going to watch that kind of stuff very, very closely, make sure your taxes are structured. make sure that you're putting money aside to pay those taxes if you're doing 1099, and that each individual contract really spells out exactly what it is that you want from that job. Because like I said, the people who have been upset at a new job, it's because they end up having to stay longer than the 8 hours that they said, and they didn't realize, and the contract said at chairman's discretion, the hours, that kind of stuff. And they end up getting stuck 10 hours instead of 8. Or like I mentioned before, getting paid W-2 instead of a 1099, which is not what they wanted. So it's super specialized, and I would take it upon myself to hire at least an accountant to make sure to manage all that kind of stuff. Yes. Yeah, so like I was saying at the beginning, some of the private equity groups do maintain a portion of equity for the physicians. So USAP, for example, a lot of the physicians with those groups that were bought out were not bought out in their entirety. So like, for example, some of the other management groups, you've got 100 shares in this corporation. The corporation comes in, you give up 100 shares, and now you're just an employed person. They retain some portion of equity. So my guess is that those contracts that you've seen are those situations in which the management group came in. They did not wholly outright buy the group, and they retained some portion of equity, and that's what you're getting offered a position in. The nice thing about that is that it's happened similarly in surgery as well, and some of the other specialties. If there's subsequent sales down the line, those additional shares could be monetized further. So for example, I know several people who were bought in our part of the country by Summit Health, which was a big regional player in all branches of medicine. Summit Health was purchased by CityMD, which was a big urgent care place. And now VillageMD was bought by Walgreens. CityMD was bought, I don't know. But anyway, it's hard to keep track. You need like one of those boards with the yarn to track everybody. But on those subsequent sales, they monetize those portions of equity. So even though it's equity within one of those national management corporations, on subsequent sales, you might be offered the potential for monetization again. So those kinds of situations could be potentially very lucrative. Again, not advice. Check with a lawyer. Any other questions? Yes.
Dr. Tufik, excellent presentation. I just wanted to mention real quick, especially because there are a lot of younger faces I see in the crowd. I can't tell you how many times I've done contracts either with residents or myself where I've been told by the hospital or the institution, don't bother getting an attorney, you can't change this contract anyway, you're just wasting your time and money. And I've been able to change every contract I've had and probably been successful with most resident trainees also. So just, spend the money, don't get cheap. I know a couple $1,000s when you're first coming out seems like a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. So make sure you guys protect yourselves because the hospitals are not looking out for you guys. Just keep that in mind.
Yes.
Yeah, just a segue on that. The hospitals and employers of physicians don't have our best interests in mind. And I'm interested in your thoughts on collective bargaining as physicians. You mentioned resident unions, but there are also physician unions. I did my training in New Zealand where the 5,000 doctors have a single contract and they negotiate it periodically. And the working conditions are very good.
This is an interesting subject because, full disclosure, I am part of a faculty union at Rutgers University. And up until about 2 years ago, I would have echoed your sentiment about the positivity in general. Sometimes it still requires you to take matters into your own hand despite being part of a union. Our personal experience has been that we've still had to fight on our own, and being part of a union has not helped us personally as much because it's still us, and then we have like the weight of the union, but we do everything. So to answer your question, I honestly don't know where I fall on the spectrum. I would have said probably a few years ago, I'm all for it. It's a way to get our power back versus, especially hospitals and healthcare systems are vertically integrating like crazy. It's not something, it's a topic of this discussion, but like if you look at the pyramid of companies that United Healthcare owns, how do you negotiate against that? They own the entire supply chain. Is collective bargaining a potential tool to fight back against that? Maybe. There are some situations, I know that it's big in California at a couple of institutions, and they've had some partial success. But it's tough. Again, I'm part of a union up until a couple of years ago. Up until the time I needed them, I thought that they'd be much stronger advocates for us. But they're basically like, we'll forward whatever you write. And I'm like, okay, thanks. Sorry that I was hoping to give you a more uplifting answer, but that's the truth. It's I don't think it's a cure-all. Even in the places that gained some notoriety in the United States from collective bargaining, it's still a work in progress. Any other questions? Yes.
Not a question, a comment. There's some independent groups that are recruiting in the exhibit hall. So please, if you're interested, go to their booths.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming.